So if you can create a happy patient, yes, it turns into a great satisfaction score. It turns into that Medicare reimbursement. So all these things start to affect that maybe go under the radar in the past. That is behavioral opportunity that we can try and focus on as part of our considerations going forward.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this GPO Spotlight here on Power Supply, I am going to be speaking with Trevor Rotondo, Director of Strategic Sourcing at HealthTrust Performance Group. We're going to be talking about laundry, linen, and supply expense management in healthcare today. It's a conversation that I'm hearing come up more and more often. Trevor's going to give us some best practices and some tips around managing what might surprise you is in the top 5 purchase services spend among HealthTrust members. And the HealthTrust membership is not a small sample size, over 1,800 acute facilities and 65,000 non-acute locations. And I can tell you that linen is definitely in both acute and non-acute. HealthTrust is a performance improvement company committed to strengthening performance and clinical excellence through an aligned membership model and advisory services leveraging operator experience, scale, and innovation. So we're going to get into it today with Trevor Rotondo, Director of Strategic Sourcing at HealthTrust. Stay with me. We'll be right back.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Power Supply.
I'm Justin Poulin, and I'm here now with Trevor Rotondo, Director of Strategic Sourcing at HealthTrust Performance Group, and we're going to be talking about, well, I'm going to say it's a hot topic here on Power Supply because we did have an episode recently, but I'd say not so much a hot topic in the past because I haven't heard a lot of people talking about laundry and linen and supply expense. But boy, have we had a lot of discussions recently. And Trevor, I know you're an expert in this area. And so we're really excited to have you on the show today. And I want to welcome you to the Power Supply podcast, your first appearance.
Thanks, Justin. I appreciate you having me on the show. And yeah, it's one of those categories that a lot of people are starting to look at now and really looking for help and how to save money on their expense on laundry and linen supplies.
I got to say, I mentioned this is your first appearance, but this is like one of those topics that I feel like, probably gets revisited fairly regularly, especially because, to your point, might not be an area that a lot of health systems have really focused on lately. And so I get the sense that as they become more familiar and they focus more, that they're going to have questions, right? And so you're going to be a great resource to anybody listening in that regard.
They do. And a lot of times we have some people that go out and they kind of run down the path a little bit and then they call up and go, am I looking at the right stuff here? And, sometimes it makes a lot of sense, but there's some things they're missing. And, we do a lot of double checking on work that they've kind of gotten to the finish line and go, some things just aren't lining up. And sometimes it just comes straight to us from the beginning and say, hey, help us where you can. What don't we know? I
know we're going to talk a lot about KPIs and, this is an area, especially because it's a service that can be difficult. Before we jump all the way in, though, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and talk about your background. Like, how did you get so experienced in linen?
Kind of like this meeting, right? We just kind of jumped right in. I spent some time in education, did some EVS and history in hotels and hospitality on the food and beverage and the hospitality side in hotels. And then I came into healthcare about 11 and a half years ago with HealthTrust. A little different in hospitals than it is in hospitality with the linen specs and different things that are needed. And really just kind of dived right in, having conversations with suppliers and hospitals on what their needs were, the differences in linen spec from what you would put in a hotel to what would you put in the hospital. And a lot of that came down to, where hospitals were trying to not mirror what hotels were doing, but really it came down to, trying to mirror what patient care was getting, where what, hotel guests were getting, right? To try and get that same experience over and improving that, the quality of linen and quality of linen supply and be able to manage the expense in adjusting that patient experience. And just learning by talking to the patients and the members and the suppliers and really getting a good feel for it and just practicing and doing it over and over again with these people.
So interestingly, just some information that you all shared with me in preparation for our discussion today. Something that I definitely didn't realize, laundry and linen services in the top 5 purchase services expense among HealthTrust members. It's not hard to, see why this is becoming an area of focus for HealthTrust members, right, Trevor?
Yeah, it's also one of those, if you don't have linen, it's one of those supplies that can shut a system down, right? It's one thing that you have to have every day. There's a cost associated with it. It's one of the higher costs. And as you said, it's in that top 5, whether you're doing it in-house or you're doing it as an outsource with a supplier. The spend gets up there, and if you're not tracking it, it can start to get away from you.
So we say it's a top 5 purchase services expense among HealthTrust members. The sample size is large because HealthTrust serves approximately 1,800 hospitals and health systems in the U.S. And also the United Kingdom, and then also 65,000 non-acute locations. And that's one of those things, like sometimes when we talk about clinical and clinical excellence, obviously laundry and linen tie into that area, but we don't always think about those non-acute locations. But when you're talking laundry and linen services, you're absolutely including non-acute and acute settings. Is that right?
Yeah. And not only is it a different type of program, those non-acute settings also have a different need for a linen spec, right? A quality of linen, different type of linen that will go into each one of those different facility types of non-acute space.
Is that one of the challenges? I mean, even as you work with like the organizations, the service organizations that are supplying laundry and linen services, is there a difference between acute and non-acute, even in the way that they work with health systems?
Billing is very different. The type of supplier that you can put into your facility can be different. Not all suppliers are capable of absorbing the volume that a hospital produces. It's based on equipment and region. So when you're out there sourcing a supplier, you may say, I have supplier X right in my backyard, but they may not be equipped to handle the volume of an acute, or they may not have the linen spec specific to, say, a behavioral hospital or a sleep lab, which requires a different linen spec altogether. So there's a little more that goes into selecting a supplier than just knowing that somebody's in your area and can service, a hospital in that same market.
I'm also thinking of just the logistics of it, right? Like it's almost like in a non-acute setting, you've got to have like a whole different kind of fleet than you would to have to service an acute setting. Like obviously you can utilize the loading dock and do a large volume, kind of shipment, I guess. Whereas in those non-acute settings, I'm imagining you're talking a lot more inventory being moved by a lot more vehicles.
Yeah, that's the difference between sending a truck to the loading dock where it can just be rolled off in a big cart and put in a room, as opposed to a box truck that's got to go, milk truck for lack of a better, where they're hitting 10 different facilities all in the same radius and then loading it down off the truck and putting it on shelves. So it's got a little different labor costs associated with it, a different fleet of truck, some more white glove because it gets shelved inside. So different cost variance and a lot smaller volume. And as opposed to sending to a hospital a full truck, sending to 10 non-acute spaces with a smaller truck and the same, driver. So,
the reason I kind of started with the logistics and kind of painting that picture is, you talked about how not a lot of members have really focused on this despite, where it's kind of in the standings of the non-labor expense categories. So I'm assuming that there's a great deal of challenges. And you even said once they get down the road, then they'll kind of come back and say, are we looking at this the right way? Like, how are we doing? So what have those challenges been that have, maybe made this a sleepy category despite the fact that it's a pretty sizable expense for healthcare?
It's one of those categories that in the past have been, it's just easy sometimes to stay with your current supplier, maybe cycle after cycle. Sometimes they'll offer a savings or they'll offer to waive an increase so that you renew. And by the time you look at the category, there's been some attrition, right? Maybe somebody different is looking at it after, 2 5-year cycles. Then you go out to bid. So I'm working with a member now who received their RFP bids in, and they're all bid differently, right? Some suppliers will charge by per pound and some suppliers will charge by per piece. And the member said, how do I compare this? How am I supposed to look at this and really see apples to apples? And if you don't have the experience on doing it every day, it really is like comparing apples and oranges. And what you want to do to have a good cohesive analysis is make sure it's red apples to red apples and not just apples to apples. And, that's kind of where our expertise comes in.
So with like the per piece per pound, do you see more per piece in the non-acute and per pound in the acute setting, or is it really more like based more on the supplier methodology?
Well, and that's really what it is, right? It comes down. So mostly, yes, in the acute space, you want to see it priced as a per pound. Most suppliers, when you do per piece, that's hand counting or even microchip counting. That takes a lot of time, a lot of labor, and that relays usually into your costs, or it can. Right. So you do get into a per piece if it's a smaller hospital, 100 beds or less. If you're talking about a 400 to an 800 bed hospital, to try and piece count, you can never do it. So it gets into really a per pound.
Now, what about just in terms of managing this? So again, a lot of times you'll see procurement, right? And it happens a lot in purchase services and, obviously a hot kind of category or topic or buzzword in the industry now is indirect spend, which I would kind of put this into that purchase services, indirect spend, depending on how regionalized the supplier is, which is pretty prevalent in this space, right? A lot of the suppliers are more regional than they are national. So maybe they fall into that indirect spend category even more closely. The thing I know about trying to manage purchase services and why it can be such a challenge is that it is so much related to the quality of the service and a lot of things that aren't necessarily measurable. To your point, apples to apples, you get more apples to oranges. And so what makes it so difficult? Like you sign the contract, but is it easy for this to get away from somebody unless they're really having regular business reviews with their supplier and maintaining a close watch?
Even before we get to the contract, right? But even before you sign that contract and the ink dries, there are things that go into your price that, you want to focus on, right? That goes into what is your total spend. And a lot of that, not just maybe fees or surcharges that are in there, but behavioral things that you can address, and put some of that onus back on the supplier to help you with. And a lot of that extra costs we see in linen losses beyond what normally gets fed into wear and tear, it's that behavior that says, oh, we threw these sheets, they were a little bloody, and we threw them into the red bag waste. Well, we overpaid our red bag where it shouldn't have gone because now I'm paying to throw out 1 pound of red bag. And then I'm also paying to replace that $5 sheet that the laundry operator could have washed and gotten the blood out or would have determined that it is not reusable, and at their cost, they would have replaced it. So there are some educational things that can be done, and some of that is gathering that information from your supplier and figuring out how to work together and continuously at a QBR, a quarterly business review, go over what those losses look like, what are we doing to educate, and how are we improving, quarter over quarter.
How common are those quarterly business reviews? Do you see that as like a standard that everybody approaches? Because I can tell you, I before I started doing all of this,
right?
I worked. Yeah, I already know the answer because I've done. I can tell you, I've sold a purchase service before. Early in my career when I first left nursing, and that was how I stuck out. Was I continuously stayed in front of the customer. And we continue to talk about areas for improvement and look at the spend. And, a lot of that, creep can happen. And then all of a sudden the category manager feels blindsided. And I just kind of knew, even as a supplier, that wasn't good for me, right? Like, you might see your spend go up, but if somebody felt like they were blindsided, by an increased cost on the budget, it definitely put you a little bit on the defensive as a supplier versus, hey, let's just get in there and have the conversation so they know why. Because it might be you're doing a great job and they're just increasing the utilization, right? And you can see that, I would think, in linen too, that there's probably more than just one linen services provider, and they're kind of competing for, territory and linen volumes in your health system. Is that also true?
Yeah, and they'll all make guarantees on how they can help reduce your waste, meaning overusing sheets, and how they can reduce your loss. But if you're the supplier that's in the building, it's about getting in front of the right people, because what really happens is my direct contact is, as a supplier, if I were a supplier, my direct contact is that EVS team, right? It's that director of EVS, or it's that manager of linen distribution, right? That's my everyday, my route driver is going in and talking to the linen distribution manager and the EVS director sometimes. What they're not getting in front of that you do at QBR is sit down in front of the VP of supply chain or the CFO of the hospital, because what happens is every quarter, as a supplier, I send out, in their shoes, I send out an invoice for loss every 3 months. And maybe I'm sending you an invoice for $100,000 that is above and beyond what weekly invoices you've been paying for the last 13 weeks. That says, in addition to your rental of linens, you lost $100,000 worth of linens. And the CFO looks around and goes, what is this extra $100,000 check? And they blame the supplier. Well, what did you do to help us? So it's about really getting in front of the right audience, right? And sometimes it does take some C-suite oversight, to drive that EVS behavioral change. And it's not to put any blame on the EVS, right? It's about getting the director of EVS, the director of nursing, and the CFO and the VP of supply chain in a meeting. And yeah, maybe it's not once a quarter. We call it a QBR. Ideally, send me the report every quarter. But let's meet at least twice a year and sit down and really go through how it's improved Q over Q, month over month, and have the tough discussions that says, we've been training your people. Here's where, and if you're an IDN, it's a bottom report. These hospitals these are great stewards. These hospitals, could probably be better stewards of. And let's imagine you have 10 hospitals. Two are always going to be on the top and two are always going to be on the bottom, whether they're the same two or not. You just always constantly look at the 2 or 3 that are at the bottom that quarter, and you work on their behavior. And before you know it, your loss and your waste has improved. And, yes, maybe your costs have gone up based on census improvements. And, we put metrics out there. When I work with a member, I try to get part of that QBR should include, and every CFO measures, right, cost in pounds per adjusted patient day is the best metric to let you know what you're spending. So if you compare that cost in those pounds of linen lost per adjusted patient day and you metric it that way, you can see your growth, your improvements behaviorally.
Yeah. I also want to ask you about, and I have 2 things, obviously I want to talk about HCAP scores and patient experience and how that's impacted by linen, because obviously that impacts reimbursement. But even before I go there, we've seen a lot, inflation, right, has impacted costs. There isn't anybody listening to this podcast who isn't aware of that. But is it going up proportionately in a service like linen and laundry the way that we see with products and the access to raw materials, or is it on a different kind of trajectory for different reasons?
So we are, right, cost beyond control, or whatever you want to call it, cost beyond control, unforeseen cost increases, things associated. I think, most of linen is, labor driven, energy driven, right? Whether it's fuel or natural gas propane. And it is cotton driven, right? Supply expense driven through being able to receive linens, right? And that is not just the cost of cotton increases, but it could be the cost of restrictions around supply chain, right? And I think we ran into that, in the year or two after COVID more than anything. I think a lot of that supply chain constraints have started to open back up. But a big piece of that, we see minimum wage going up in a lot of states year over year until it hits a threshold, right? We see that in the state of Florida. We see it in California, Georgia, a lot of states are adopting that. And even in states where minimum wage hasn't increased $1 a year over year, the cost of what you're paying for those, what are perceived as minimum wage jobs, are still paying at the same as what other states' minimum wage jobs are at. So if you are in a frontline employee type role and you need to keep FTEs at your laundry plant, and they're usually $2 to $3 above minimum wage, and minimum wage goes up $1, then your employees have to go up respectively that same dollar, give or take.
So it's the labor expense. It's like there's some raw materials, because obviously there is some loss of linens due to end of life or whatever, but it's not the same as like a single use product. But then we come back over to the labor expense issues that we've seen. And of course, that's going to impact purchase services. It might be for different reasons, but the costs are going up in laundry and linen due to the labor expense. And
it has, shortages. And we've seen it starting to level out a little more. We try and put some constraints around it. Language, if labor goes up, we have some allowability, but if you don't institute something, so let's imagine even for a second in the state of Florida where we know it's going up $1 an hour. It's already in the laws. We'll go up $1 an hour every year. Just because it goes up $1 an hour doesn't mean that you've increased your AWR, your average wage rate for your employees. So if you come back and you show me that, yes, you have increased that AWR equitably, then that's a conversation we have, and we can allow, maybe for that increase in cost, because if you can't provide our linen, then we can't provide our service to our patients. So whether I come through my current supplier or I do the heavy lift and go, well, we're not going to allow for this increase, we're going to go source another supplier, they're going to have the same labor constraints and costs. So we may as well continue to work together to make sure that you can provide the linen I need to provide the services and care I need for my patients.
Yeah, that's where that real value-based perspective comes from, right?
Right. It comes down to making sure you're providing the service and the quality of care to the patients so that their patient satisfaction, right? That the linen was there, or that they were able to ask for that extra blanket, whatever it is that makes them happy, so that they fill out those patient satisfaction scores, happily, right? That there was no disruption. You didn't have to cancel procedures because there was a linen shortage, because there were not enough FTEs at the plant to produce enough clean linens for you to get. And those things, it has that trickle effect. So if you can create a happy patient, yes, it turns into a great satisfaction score. It turns into that Medicare reimbursement. So all these things start to affect that maybe go under the radar in the past. That is behavioral opportunity that we can try and focus on as part of our considerations going forward.
It's interesting. You made me think about that delicate balance between having a sustainable partnership and sustainability in the supply chain on the service side. At the same time, we're trying to keep cost control in place, but part of that expense might be that you're actually choosing a partner that's going to have a more sustainable model versus having, disruption in their ability to deliver the service itself. So you're kind of, constantly trying to pick the right partner to balance that equation. And again, bringing that back to value-based purchasing concepts, right? So let's talk about value, but let's talk more about the value that you're able to bring, because again, we talked about 1,800 plus members, visibility to this spend, and it's a top 5 non-labor expense. Let's start with like benchmarking. I want to kind of walk through a lot of this because I can imagine the RFP process is really complicated. The cost, like we were just diving into all the nuances of the costs that are going into the equation. I bet that can be very elusive and difficult for, somebody in procurement or working in supply chain or contracting to try to figure those things out. Let's start with benchmarking. How do you even establish a benchmark in this space?
And that's a big question, right? Because everybody wants to know. That's the primary, right? People are not getting into that. Let's just roll over our contract one more time. They at least want to know, what am I paying compared to what everyone else is paying, right? Maybe it's an easier question answered if I own 10 hospitals or I manage 10 hospitals and they're all in the same city, right? Different neighborhoods, same city. I can kind of compare one to the other and figure out my behavioral costs, right? But I want to know what that is compared to other customers as well, right? Maybe we signed a bad contract. Maybe my supplier is just, they're feeding me a 5% year over year increase, but CPIU has been, 3%. Right. And a lot of that may have happened under some old agreements when CPIU was at, 2% for a decade before we hit COVID. So we did have a lot of contracts that we were seeing. Well, they were written in as from 5% and it was recommended to go to bid. But at least now everybody wants to know, how do we benchmark? How do we see what other people are paying? At HealthTrust, we've looked through a lot of data, right? We have a Valify tool that we can access that our members can subscribe to access as well, or non-members that can subscribe to the Valify tool to do a little digging around in there. We have some experts on that Valify team that can assist. My team, we've got, just experts that have done, I can probably tell you based on some customers, members that I've worked with, if you have a hospital in a given city that's about a given size or a non-acute in that market, I can pretty much gauge where you would be in price based on other members in similar markets with similar suppliers, just based on my experience. But definitely through some of the tools, at least I can tell you where you should be and maybe understand some of your behavior. The more data you send, the better we can gauge where you are and what you could be doing.
You mentioned kind of doing that assessment and determining whether or not to go out to bid, because you have access to that information. But I can imagine too, it's for a lot of health systems that are strapped for time. Every time they put something out to bid and do an RFP, I feel like a lot of them are trying to build that from scratch and they're already finding the KPIs and sort of the things that matter to them is a little bit elusive. And so sometimes an engagement like that can miss the mark a little bit if you don't have somebody with expertise on a category like linen. So how do you kind of augment for successful RFI, RFP if you say, come in and take a look at that data with them and say, yeah, this probably is one you should consider putting out to bid. How do you help them get through that next step?
Yeah, we've developed some tools, right, that would be helpful in collecting that, what we call RFI data, right? That's spend and usage. It is one thing to go out to linen bid with just, we process 100,000 pounds of linen a year, according to our supplier, and then take that out to bid. But there's more that goes into costing, right? There's surcharges sometimes that a supplier has as part of the contract. There are specialty items. What are you doing for scrubs? Scrubs are never charged per pound like that, or just rarely. So there are a lot of specialty items that go into your costs and I call out scrubs specifically because they are, one, a high loss item, right? They tend to walk out of hospitals.
Wear them home. I'm a nurse. We wore them home. I'm just being honest.
I wasn't going to call out nursing, but yeah.
Yeah, I knew you weren't, but I can't because I am a nurse.
Nurses do. Surgeons do. I'm not going to stop a surgeon from leaving the hospital and going back to the office in a pair of scrubs. And then we're not going to remind them that even if I have a scrub machine on site, that they didn't bring back their last 5 pairs. And we're going to go ahead and give that surgeon another pair of scrubs so they can perform surgery that day. So we'll eat that $10 set of scrubs cost or $12, whatever we're at right now, depending on what we're using. So we eat that as loss. We are going to send out 5 blankets every time a patient gets transferred and says, I'm cold. Can you give me some blankets? And we're going to put them on an ambulance. And we send 5 blankets out on the bus and we never see those back again. And, there's ways around that too. If we're not using EMS linen, which I don't know that everybody knows, usually it gets dyed pink or purple or green or something. And it's just linen that's not quite good enough to put in a patient room, but still has life cycle left on it. And it's kind of a throwaway item. So I pay half price for that. And when it gets lost, we expect it not to come back to the hospital. So there are programs that we put in place.
But you're not paying a premium.
Right. If you're paying $3 a sheet, you're paying $1.50 for the EMS linen, right? You're paying half price because it's got half that value of a patient room quality piece of linen, right? And that's what you would put in the ED. You'd put that down in the ED, and this way when the patient says going to have, 2-3 blankets, that's what you give them. You give them the purple blankets and they go out on the ambulance with it. And when you don't get it back, no harm, no foul. It just cut your loss in half, at least for that one SKU.
All right, so let's talk about where you come in significant expertise, which is going to be negotiating a strong contract, right? Setting the relationship up for success. And I'm assuming that means for both sides, right? Just the transparency and aligning on, what is the most important, in terms of how the contract's going to be administered. But also, we touched upon this already, but after you negotiate that strong contract, how do you continue to follow up on sort of tracking behavioral metrics?
Right. So negotiating the contract, right? You get down to a price, right? You've level set across all your suppliers. You figured out what your specialty items are. Sometimes people bill differently. Let's go back a step real quick. Even let's say you're non-acute and you're getting charged per piece. There are multiple ways you can be charged for that. I can need 100 sheets. Let's go sheets for a second. I'm a surgery center. I need 100 sheets in order to cover my caseload for the week. And you go, well, what happens if you have extra caseload than you're used to? All right, well, let's put a 2 days par in there just in case. And now I'm buying 127 sheets a week on lease. And the supplier goes, okay, that's your inventory. We're going to charge you based on the inventory. You use 100. We charge you for 127 because we're dedicating them to you. And we're going to charge you, round numbers, we're going to charge you $1 for 127 sheets. If you use 100, we're charging you $127. If you use 80, we're charging you $127. If you use 128, we're charging you $128. Competitor B, supplier B, is going to charge you for that same 127 sheets. They're giving you a price of 55 cents. You go, wow, 55 cents. That's much better than $1. But they charge based on total inventory. Total inventory says, well, for that 127 sheets that you're keeping at your surgery center, well, we've got to buy 127 sheets and keep that in our laundry plant.
Oh, so it's actually 110. I mean, $1.10.
Right, so, yeah. So, right, I'm paying $1.10 because I'm paying for 2X on the volume at 55 cents. Now I'm paying $1.10 a sheet, whether I use 127 or I use 100 or I use 80. So those are some things that we've got to look for, as an SME or
what
as you get into doing these.
Interesting way to adjust the unit of measure, right? Like that is a really interesting strategy.
Oh, and there are multipliers too, right? That's just the 1 day a week. That's because because I'm only delivering 1 day a week. So I need to have 2X, right? 2X is a multiplier, 2 times whatever number of sheets you need. Well, if I'm delivering 3 days a week, I don't need 2X because I'm turning it more, right? I'm washing it. I'm bringing it back to you sooner. So I don't need 1 dirty for 1 clean. So my multiplier is different. So little things like that, you've got to keep an eye on because now I'm delivering 3 days a week. It's a 1.4 multiplier. Delivering 2 days a week, it's a 1.7 multiplier. So these are little things that you want to get into with your supplier and go, well, how are you billing me? And not just look at a market basket price sheet. That's kind of the difference when you get into all these services and purchase services like linen. That is a little different than looking at, a market basket for goods that you're buying. It's not like buying products from a product supplier. When you're buying a service and they can bill it a little differently, it has some nuances we got to pay a focus to.
How much variation do you see within the same contract and the same supplier for a health system? Do the various sites end up like some have, per pound and some have per piece. And so like you're even within the same contractual agreement, trying to even benchmark your own data on the exact same contract. Is that also difficult sometimes?
I have seen hospitals, independent hospitals, so not an IDN, a single hospital with 3 different suppliers doing similar services, each with different contracts written. So different departments may contract different supplies from different suppliers, meaning because you have linen, you have microfibers, so textiles, right, uniforms, all as subsets of what linen and laundry and textiles can be, right? We kind of categorize textiles a little different than we do linen. It all kind of sits in the same family. I'd recommend looking at them both at the same time. But you may have one supplier doing your sheets, towels, pillowcases, one supplier doing your scrubs, and one supplier doing your microfibers, and have 3 different billing methodologies for 3 different suppliers. And really, I don't want to say not have their hands wrapped around it, but not understand how each one is billing differently. Right. And some people are great. There are some rock stars out there that are fully on top of their game. They know exactly what's going on. We're talking more to the ones who maybe want a little extra help, make sure that they know what they're talking about, or don't have that experience and say, and I've been there. I've been the person that says, look, I don't know anything. Please just tell me what I don't even know I don't know. And that's okay.
I could just see like having some simple calculators to be able to take that data that's not, the pricing isn't in the same format. It's not the same style. How do you create an apples to apples and lay that out? I could see some complex calculators for trying to bring that. Okay, here's your average weekly spend, or, and I can see why you have that kind of single metric, because no matter what, that metric that you mentioned really boils it all down, right? You said per procedure. Is that what it is? What was
procedure.
Can you tell us what the metric was?
Acute, yeah. Surgery center, caseload, procedure, either way. And it gets to, I'm impartial, right? I don't have phrase. I don't have a dog in the fight, right? Sometimes when you sit down with the supplier and they go, no, really, I'm telling you the truth here. Here's what you're missing. I was like, okay, thank you, Coyote. Here's my hen house. So it's one of those where I can look at it impartially and I'm on your side. And I can go back to the vendor and I can look at them and go, look, here's what what I think is fair, right? Because I want all parties. If I'm setting up my vendor for failure, then as a member, I'm not a representative of the member. I'm not going to be successful on behalf of the member, right? I can't just take, right? I got to create a fair partnership so that the supplier is getting what they need in order to provide the member what they need, right? So it's got to have some give and take so that everybody walks away a little happy, so that they can provide and receive the service they need.
I mean, yeah, that's what partnership is about, right? It's got to be good for both parties. All right, here's the last thing I want us to walk through before we wrap up. And this one is really the difference between outsourcing and then, customer owned goods and managing their own on-premise laundry, right? So I can imagine we're talking about outsourced almost exclusively to this point. But if you've got your own on-premise laundry, then you're trying to figure out what your cost is comparative to outsourcing. Now you're just in a whole different ball of wax of difficulty, I would think.
Yeah. And let's go. So we talked about outsource wholly, right? Where at rental, they own all the linens and I have lost fees because they're buying it all. That middle step is I own my linen. That's the COG you mentioned, where I own my linen. Somebody else washes it for me. In OPL and on-premise laundry, and while they may be great in some markets, and they are, right? If you have a rock star operating your laundry department and your equipment is brand new or it's well maintained and you have backup plans for business continuity, then, keep running with it, right? It's a great option. But in OPL and on-premise laundry means I own my equipment. So I own the depreciation of the equipment. I own my linens. I own managing the laundry operation, the FTEs that goes into that, washing the linens, making sure it's all prepared, the quality of linen, that all falls on my shoulder. And a lot of times what happens is 2 things. One, it's taking up precious real estate in my hospital where maybe that's fine. Maybe I have the extra, maybe I'm a 400 licensed bed. I'm only operating 300. So it's okay if I have an on-premise laundry. Then maybe I'm at capacity, which is not a bad thing to have, but I can turn that into storage, or I can turn that into a patient experience space, right? So it's real estate. So you gotta think about the dollars per square foot that you're spending to rent your own space as a laundry. Then generally a lot of the equipment goes bad. Do you want to spend capital expense on buying new equipment? Right? Are you as efficient, right? Laundry operators will work on processing pounds per hour, right? How much laundry can they put through their machines per hour? Pounds per operating hour is what they call it. So are you as efficient as a laundry plant, right? Are you wasting FTE hours? What's your labor benefit that you're getting out of that? And then you are managing all that. Well, as a hospital, I want to be in the patient care business. I don't want to be in the linen and laundry business. So you have to determine once your equipment has hit its value, once you've pulled all of the equity out of that machine and you got to talk about replacing it again. Is that really the business you want to be in now that we can start looking at outsourcing that and maybe getting a better price? I'm buying linens at my cost for buying it just for my hospital, whereas my laundry operator is buying it for all of their customers. So maybe they're getting that at a better price. So it's definitely something to consider going from an OPL to, even if you consider a COG because you own your linens, but even if you want to go to a rental from a COG or an OPL, COG being customer owned goods, they'll buy it from you. If it's usable, they'll take it off your books so you don't have to depreciate it anymore. It's, the vendor will buy anything usable from you, and that's negotiable in your contract so that you're not sitting on this stock, that's still depreciating on your books.
Yeah, I like the timing of when is it a good time to consider changing your model, right? And pretty much once you start to see that the repairs and service on your current equipment, if you start thinking, should we buy new equipment? You need to start thinking, should we also look at potentially outsourcing it, and taking advantage of the fact that we have some experts that are doing large volumes, to control costs. It's really a center of excellence, right? I mean, that's kind of what you're talking about, is allowing them to be your outsourced center of excellence. So, Trevor, this has been an awesome conversation. I don't know if it went as fast for you as it did for me.
Yeah, I didn't even watch the clock.
Yeah, this was a robust conversation. We packed a lot in to well over a half hour, and I still feel like you could easily pick up the phone and talk to somebody who's out there listening and talk for another couple of hours and really get into the weeds. But I think we did a nice job of talking about where you bring some expertise, how you play a very important impartial role and sort of evaluating all of these different options. And I think the sustainability of just continuing to monitor these and the best practice of having, regular business reviews, whether they're quarterly or I think you said a minimum of semi-annually, is super important. So I do want to let everybody know. Well, first off, follow HealthTrust Performance Group on LinkedIn. It's not just going to be about linen, obviously. There's lots of great conversations and information available for you there. But I also want to encourage listeners to reach out to HealthTrust for a consultation on linen supply expense management. And current members can contact their account manager. You can also send an email to commercial@healthtrustpg.com. That's healthtrustpg.com, commercial@healthtrustpg.com. And additionally, if you are a HealthTrust member and are attending HealthTrust University Conference in August, you can find Trevor at HealthTrust Village and continue this conversation if you don't get in contact with him in the meantime. Trevor, great job. Anything you want to add before we wrap up today?
No, you've been great, Justin. I just appreciate you having me on the show, give us the chance to talk. And you are absolutely right. We kind of just touched the surface, and anybody who calls is probably going to have a lot of specifics to their unique program, right? And that's something we want to encourage, that discussion. What are you doing today, and how can we help you with what you're doing?
That was Trevor Rotondo, Director of Strategic Sourcing at HealthTrust Performance Group, talking about laundry and linen services. And even there at the very end, I mean, it was already kind of a complex conversation around how to really benchmark and evaluate the performance of your suppliers in this category when we're simply talking about outsourcing. But then, of course, he described at the very end customer-owned goods versus managing your own on-premise laundry and maybe some timing around that. So HealthTrust can help you manage this category or become an expert yourself. They're going to be able to support you with benchmarking, RFI and RFP contracting, strategy expertise, transparency around total supply expense, and focusing on negotiating strong contracts and provide advice on processes for continued follow-up on tracking behavioral metrics, including everything from waste, product selection, and losses. And advice on processes for continued follow-up on tracking the behavioral metrics, which are just so critical in this category. So once again, make sure you are following HealthTrust Performance Group on LinkedIn. Definitely want to encourage you listeners to reach out to HealthTrust for a consultation on the linen supply expense management. Current members can contact their account manager for more information, and others can email commercial@healthtrustpg.com. And additionally, as a reminder, if you're a HealthTrust member and are planning to attend the HealthTrust University Conference in August, you'll be able to find Trevor at the HealthTrust Village and be able to speak with him directly. So once again, thank you all for listening to this GPO Spotlight here on Power Supply.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on your iPhone or Android. Simply search for Power Supply in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. We look forward to hearing from you.